Are you listening?
This is the Rob Scott Show.
Damn.
I mean, really, like, if we're not trying to change the world, what are we doing?
Yeah.
Welcome back to the Rob Scott Show. I am here with Sarah, and I think Sarah's like a little too excited today. What are we doing today, Sarah?
Yeah, this is a special episode, I think, for myself and the listeners. I think this episode's going to be about you today, Rob.
Okay.
I've prepared a couple questions that I'd like to ask you on this episode. So, not only can our listeners get to kind of know who you are better, but kind of know about how you came to do this work and what it really means to you and kind of your philosophies and values. We don't often get to just focus on you. I know you've been interviewed on many other podcasts, but now I
Sure.
get to interview you. So maybe that's
Awesome. Okay,
that's
cool.
my excitement.
Yeah.
And I am gonna encourage our listeners to check out more about you on robscott.com or your other channels. I don't necessarily want to give kind of the textbook about Rob's life. I kind of want to dig into some of the nuances that maybe other people haven't read, or if people have been following you, they don't know. So feel free to
Awesome.
just share away.
Yeah, I'll do my best. All right.
Okay, so like I said, I prepared a couple questions. We'll start with one. If we get through them all, great. If we don't, and you feel like talking about something else or a story comes to mind, like, please share it. So
You got it. All right. Sweet.
all right. So I know that you've been through a lot in your early childhood. I'm talking about maybe under 10, and some of our listeners might also know about that too. But I would love to hear about that time in your life in the context of kind of story. So for our listeners, Rob's done a talk for the foundation called The Power of Story, and it's I think one of your well-received talks. They were all well-received, but that was kind of a very popular one. And then we've talked about story a lot on the podcast. So the question is kind of, what is the story that you had early in your life, looking at kind of 0 to 10, that you're the most proud of overcoming?
Wow. Okay. So these are not going to be simple questions. I was really excited to sort of pull from the hip of like, oh, here's that answer, right? That's a
Or
really,
what's your favorite color?
right. Yeah, that's a very thoughtful question. We'll get to color in another episode because you and I just talked about that recently. Yeah. So I mean, the loud one that comes to mind is just victim. And what I don't want to do here with you is just oversimplify the answers. Like I really want to dig a little deeper. First that comes to mind before I even pick it, right? If I say victim for sure, but I'll see if there's more that comes up. It's that I think at that time you don't see any of it, right? Like it's almost like that's what becomes unconscious to you. And what was deeply meaningful later was I sort of woke up to a lot of the kind of software that I had running that I was putting on to the moment that was continuing to cause me issues and all that stuff. So because victim so loud, I mean, victim for sure, right? But also just really angry. I remember having this sense of like, why was I born? Like I didn't ask to be here. Why, what kind of I was also brought up in a very Christian environment, and so the narrative there is you're born in and be like Jesus, and maybe after you die you'll go to heaven, and all those stories that I think we're probably familiar with. And so if there's a God, I was like very angry with that God, going, hey, like I didn't ask to be here, and why has it been so incredibly difficult? And it really wasn't just personalized. Like that wasn't, I mean, really ever that I can remember. And I think, if we were to ask my mom, I think she'd agree with this kind of stuff. It was often put out into the, like, why is anyone suffering like this? Like, why is there pain like this in the world? Why are we treating each other so badly? Why are people so dysfunctional in all the ways that they seem to be? And that had another, like the problem with that is that it became kind of universal, right? It was like I almost saw that pain in every direction that I looked. So in a sense, later I learned, how we tend to project our stuff onto the world. In a huge way, I was projecting how difficult and hard and unfair the world or the universe, was. And I remember being just really underneath kind of pissed off about that. To jump ahead, once I started doing meaningful work on myself with somebody that I still talk to weekly, a guy named Will Holm, who was, has been just amazing in my life as somebody to help me get out of some of these things. The problem of it is in that projection, you end up getting stuck. Like there's no way to escape kind of what you've painted onto the world in a sense. And so I kept kind of painting in that the world is horrible and like stepping into that reality over and over and over and over again. So victim, but also anger. And then because that anger was so big for me, it was almost like I couldn't own the anger. It really only came out in a projection. And so I wouldn't have told you that I was angry. Like, I don't know when I was younger, and I'm not just talking under 10, I'm talking like into my teens and 20s. I think I was so angry that Will would tell you that I couldn't even describe being angry, right? I took on a persona, or who I would have liked to have been, of, I've called it in different talks, being Fonzie cool, right? As a kid, I saw Fonzie in Happy Days, and he was just, nothing bothered him, like nothing was outside of his control. He was so together. And I think I really, not consciously, not like I was trying to be Fonzie then, but as I look back, I was trying to be like that, right? I was trying to be powerful like that. And that was not true at all. Like inside, I was a disaster, but all I wanted to portray was like, I'm cool, I've got this, like nothing scares me, I'm tough, all these things. And so, not to just keep babbling away, but psychologically for me, I had no real sense of like what healthy anger is, or the beginning stages of that, like frustration and whatnot. And so in some of that later work, I had to really re-educate myself on what are healthy emotions and how do you feel them and express them and hold appropriate boundaries and all that kind of stuff. And so I could just babble away, but I don't know if that gets at some of that answer for you.
No, I mean, that's great. And they kind of build. So that's perfect, because you kind of already segued in, but not to at all in any way to sensationalize your life or your story or what you've been through. But like, victim is loud for a lot of people, and who've gone through things as difficult as you, or similar to you, or not as difficult as you. That's so that I love that you not that you experienced that, because you don't want anyone to go through it, but like, I love that you are an example of what you're talking about. And so that's what I'm trying to learn more about in this. So the next question is, because we've talked a lot about self, and how self is, it's a lot of things, but it's a model, it's a construct built of past experiences, right? So we get these stories from these things that happen to us that create the story of victim. So my next question to you is, maybe later on, but this is pre kind of your awakening, your fundamental shift. How did that story of victim then show up in a model of how you behaved after that? Like paint for our listeners where you started. You were a kid and things happened, you became victim, but then there's a little space in time where that escalated. And that's kind of where we get our clients, right? When they're like, my thoughts, behaviors, emotions aren't right. And you already started to talk about kind of this manifesting of this stuck anger, but like, how do you see that story that you had as a younger child then became this model of who you were before you kind of had the fundamental shift?
Yeah, so it's interesting, and I don't know that I've ever really gone into the details of this publicly, but I actually had, the seed or the meaningful kind of wake up of the fundamental shift way before I actually became functional as a human. And so to explain that might be difficult. I think in the way that we quickly tell my story on other podcasts or whatever, it's not the deep dive into the timeline. But it was, I was 19 and I really had this deep, profound kind of wake up experience. And it was after that tons of the chaos continued, right? So you said, okay, there was a lot of tough stuff that happened prior to 10 years old. My 10 to 20 was maybe equally as bad. And then my 20 to late 20s, maybe not quite 30, but like getting close to that, was maybe the worst. And, the victim type stuff that really was done to me as a child. And just for anybody who's heard none of that, just quickly, was really aggressive sexual abuse for years. It was, dysfunction in the family, a lot of standard things like divorce and just all this stuff. But I didn't really ever develop healthy sense of safety, or a really healthy formation of how to deal with any of the emotions, let alone just the anger and all that stuff. And so that was actually a seed, this kind of sense of like, what kind of creator or whatever would do this to a human or to humans in general? Like what an asshole he must be, kind of thing, to cause this kind of chaos, was the seed of what I call like almost a koan for me, right? Which is that Eastern tradition of the unanswerable question. It was just something that was like plaguing me in the background, like what was going on, what was going on. And so somewhere 19, I'm 19 years old, I have this profound wake up of it's very hard to put it into words because it's almost beyond description, but it was a very clear knowing that has never left me. It wasn't like a state experience only that just went away and then I was hoping to get it back or something. It was really like a permanent understanding of how we could really understand the illusion of separateness, how there really is oneness. And a part of that kind of came along with it was like, wow, humans are really at the biggest level only fighting themselves. What if we could see how we're actually in this together? And I can downgrade the profound oneness, energetically that I felt, and really just talk about it as separate humans. Like if we could just kind of realize that we're all on spaceship Earth together, that we're all, only fighting each other, that we really don't have another enemy besides ourselves. All we have to decide to do is like see that, understand that, and it starts to solve all the problems, right? We don't have to behave differently. We don't have to be lost in addiction and all that. So it was this profound wake up experience, but I didn't have any of the maturity of a human being to like integrate that into a mature, young man that could do much with that. So it was almost like I had a lot of wisdom and some great state expansion, but the stages of being a mature human being here on planet Earth, I didn't have any of those skills. So you and I talk about non-duality. The concept of non-duality was like deadly clear to me. I got it. But if you don't integrate duality with that, that's where you start to get people who are talking about, well, there's no such thing as bad, right? Nothing is bad. So even after that wake up, well into my 20s, things that are bad, right, when you judge them, like serious drug use or really expanding your consciousness unhealthily and driving around in cars, or doing drugs and dealing drugs, or just all these different things, I was able to sort of talk myself out of the legitimate badness of those. And that led to, on top of this kind of angry core of a human, some type of wisdom that was really a mixture of not very healthy when you look at it. So I'm quite sure that's not the exact answer that you were looking for, but it led to a ton more chaos that ended up beating me up into becoming homeless, dealing with a lot of other challenges. And my homelessness wasn't as much I couldn't get a job as it was really a desire to like live outside of society. I was in a lot of ways really kind of disgusted with humanity in a sense, right? Where I understood, hey, we could all behave differently and we're choosing not to. I'm trying to yell that to power structures like police and, my parents and just anybody who would listen to me. And I sounded like, and in those moments probably was like, kind of a crazy person, right? So that led to institutions and in and out of jails and all these things. And so that's getting mixed with an idea of like, well, I'm this angry rebel who's always got this victim stuff, right? I'm not really free of that programming yet. And I can't really see all of that. I've got some access to a meaningful truth, but it's being interpreted through these lenses that are not fully exposed yet in me. And it was incredibly messy. And it led to, as I mentioned, homelessness and all these things. But that homelessness, the seed of that was a combination of real dysfunction, like real rebelling against the system and dysfunction, but also kind of a yearning for like, can I go live out on a boat somewhere and just grow my own food and be like one with consciousness and not have to deal with these other people who, like in those moments can't see what I see or whatever. And I romanticized, a bunch of my heroes, like rock and roll stars who die at 27. I was, pretty sure I was probably going to die at 27. I was okay with that. The fear of death had gone away. There were all these things. And, I woke up at 28 and then 29. And all of a sudden I'm like, wow, I'm not dead yet. What's going on? And I decided to like come back to the corporate world and really begin to mature, which is more of like a stage evolution, which takes more time to get better at being human and doing all these things. And through that, that's when I decided to come back to the corporate world. And I really began to actually have, in human terms, a very functional growth and success and other things. And, but as we often talk about, I then got cancer. So like as soon as I started getting like functional in the corporate world, I got really sick with a cancer that almost killed me. Because I still wasn't afraid of death, I didn't get the operation right away. I decided to go on a vacation that I had planned. It was like after coming back from homeless, I'd scheduled my first vacation, and I was dating a new girl at the time, and I wasn't going to give up that vacation. And, so the doctor's like, what are you doing? And so still not making great choices, but, I came back and the cancer moved all over my body and became a difficult thing. But anyway, those are,
Yeah, no, that's a great answer. And you kind of answered my next question, but I had a thought while you were sharing there, and just kind of from my perspective on you, because I know you very well through the podcast, but we've also worked together for a number of years, and we have a great relationship. And I love that we kind of take the time to look at that part of your life in that chunked out way, where you're like, I had this wake up, and it came and it never went away. And then there was still kind of maturity to follow. And we in your coaching business are trying to always do our best to deliver, to people that need help. And part of our conversation, if I can share it here, is, how do we tell people that there's this profound kind of wake up that never goes away, like you said, and also explain that, like, there's also maturing that you can do after. Right.
Yeah.
Because we live in a society where it's like, you want the first thing, the fastest thing, the loudest thing, it's hard to kind of compete with those concepts in your head, because there's a million other options. And one of our conversations in recent history around, how to do the best that we can with these programs is we came to the conclusion of like, really everything is relational. Because we aren't alone on planet Earth, and we don't exist as individuals out in the wilderness. Most of us, we have families, we have partners, we have coworkers, we have, strangers on the street, all the things. And so I love that kind of showcases where I would say maybe the kind of birth of both the fundamental shift that we've talked about extensively, and identity shifting, which is, the business that you have for decades, that kind of came to be, and why they're not the same thing.
Yeah.
And they're both so useful, and they're both, you said on a recent podcast, everything's perfect, the fundamental shift, and there's tons to do.
Right.
Identity shifting. So I just wanted to call that kind of part of your life out, because I find that to be so profound. And the reason being, just to kind of compliment you publicly, is that usually when people are so lost in victimhood and are struggling with drugs or homelessness or, lawlessness or dysfunction in their family, just to break through it and be like, I don't have to be chained down by that. Most people are like, oh, okay. And they stop, because that kind of relief from that pain and that whatever that they've been carrying is enough to kind of make them feel like they found an equilibrium. And you, like, include myself included, if I imagine going through the things that you went through in your life, having this breakthrough where I'm like, oh, I have this kind of profound sense of oneness and universal consciousness, I would be done. Like, I probably would be living on the boat, trying to grow my own food. And you've come back into not only growing yourself and working, you mentioned working with somebody yourself, but doing this work and dedicating it, which is kind of perfect, because my next set of questions kind of moves more into where we're at now. Because what I've think maybe what our listeners have gotten to hear about you, or other people have gotten to hear about you, is that first part of your life. And then you became functional and became a coach, dot. And I've said for a while, there's so much about what you've done after that, to now, that, like, I think it would be so useful to share. So that is a long segue to say, kind of, when is the moment or moments in your life after the fundamental shift, after kind of cancer, in that kind of corporate portion of your life, where you decided, I should really become a coach and do this work? And what did that like mean to you? Like, how did it, with your story of victim and your modeling of, the world at that point, how did that kind of shift and be like, oh, this is you kind of built a new self, or a different self, I should say.
Well, it's funny. I mean, there've been a lot of selves in here, right? There's a lot, and not to be cute with that, but like we're all we're all carrying a whole lot of selves, right? We could be very different in very moments, but like historically too, there have definitely been a lot of versions of me. Um, the it's, you know, if you look at the timeline, I think what I woke up to years after the fundamental shift kind of awakening was that I was, as a self, like I was trying to heal the world before I had healed myself, which I think is a very common theme for the young human, right? Like we think of a lot of young social justice warriors who are yelling at the world to be different. Like, I wish I could change the whole government. And we've joked before, you know, the Jordan Peterson idea of like, but they're not cleaning their room, right? They're not handling the things that are right in front of them. So I woke up to this, you know, oddly, like beyond worldly wisdom, but maybe universal wisdom. Let's say that this is like at the heart of being human. And I'm a drug addict, you know, teetering on homeless, later to be fully homeless, you know, like a mess. And so wisdom being yelled from that place really isn't appropriate yet, right? It hasn't gone through like the healing of self. And it, out of necessity more than wisdom, I got to the point where I was like, I have to go figure out like how to pay bills and participate in society and do these things. And, you know, I want to talk about that motivation to live outside society again. If we look back psychologically at a kid who doesn't have trust, you know, didn't develop healthy relating, didn't develop healthy, safe, you know, nurturing and connection with people, it makes a lot of sense that that guy would want to live outside, you know, alone, right? It's like, let's take this dangerous people out of the equation and live over here. Prior to that, there's a wake up. Wow, okay, I think I could change people with this. Let me help people change so that they could become trustable and wonderful and all that. But I don't have any of the teaching skills yet, or the way to really hand that to people in a meaningful way. So when I came back to the corporate world, it was definitely in a place of like, all right, I've got to actually figure out how to live, right? Not really out of a fear of death, but just like that will be more comfortable, right? Selfishly, like that will be more comfortable if I can do this. And what I found that like at the very beginning of showing up, literally like as a temp going into a company, just showing up was beating out the other people. Like if I just showed up every day, I didn't even have to be exceptional, but that made me stand out because a ton of people at that level just barely make it to work every day, right? So all of a sudden I'm at the head of that pack, and then the next pack and the next pack. And, you know, I started to win at that game, but I was really getting healthy as a self, which is deeply important to do. Then I was healthy enough as a self, you know, later now let's skip to like being vice president. All of a sudden I'm, you know, running technology at a company, and I'm doing this different stuff, and I own a house, and I have a wonderful girlfriend, and all these things are great. And people that knew me and knew what I'd been through are like, when are you going to write your book? But I was still like, I haven't even begun yet, because I really want to help people change, right? That calling, that way of being kind of never stopped for me. And so even at the company I was working at, to some degree, there was beginning to be kind of like a line at the door to talk to me, not only about how to do their job better, but people from other departments were coming to talk to me about how they were sad and how do they change their mindset and all these things. And so I was starting to get to realize, and through managing people in, you know, my corporate run, I was starting to realize how not only I could change my own behavior and my own feelings and my own emotions and thoughts, but how I can, you know, manage through that. So out of nowhere, I started a podcast in 2005, you know, right when podcasts kind of came out. I was one of the, you know, the Fundamental Shift show was one of the first ones out there. People all over the world started listening. It was, you know, kind of shocking. There weren't too many things to listen to, and there weren't that many people listening, but of the people listening, a lot of them started listening to me, and all these requests for coaching came in. You know, being already pretty grandiose about my hopes of changing the world, I thought to myself, well, maybe I'm an author or a philosopher. I don't know if I'm a coach, right? I hadn't even known about that as a profession. And I had a friend who was also my chiropractor at the time, and he was listening to the podcast. And I told him, yeah, I go, people are asking for coaching. And he basically said, he's like, I'd love to hire you as a coach. Like, would you work with me? And I knew him well, but I didn't know him deeply personally. And he shared, he's like, I want to work on my marriage. I want to grow this business. I want to do all these things. And I was like, you know, let me give this a shot with you. Let's set it up. And literally in my first conversation with him, I knew that like, that's what I was supposed to. I was like, oh, this is
okay.
it.
Okay.
Yeah. And I want to say one other thing. There really was, and I don't know if my parents would agree or they have any recollection of this, but my own recollection of being with my parents is, even as like a young child, I feel like I was trying to talk people into different ways of seeing things and behaving differently and feeling differently about things and understanding perspective shifts and all these kind of foundational tools that we can do to change the moment, right? So it was like, oh, I've kind of been doing this forever. I've been wanting to be able to do this forever. What does this look like? Like, what are really some of these tools and settings so I can share not only this wisdom, but other just functional things that are helping with the day-to-day life? That guy ended up being a real connector. He got such a great result with me that he started like just sending clients to me. He just people that he would talk to. He said, you got to work with this guy. He's great. And so I ended up having this kind of full book of work right away. And I very quickly decided to leave my corporate gig. I actually decided to leave the house I was living in and the wonderful girlfriend who's still a close friend of mine, but just for reasons that, it wasn't the forever thing. I decided to leave that relationship. And, so in a very big shift in that moment, I left a job, a house, a relationship, moved into a very small apartment in South Philadelphia, and kept doing that podcast and started coaching, and that was the beginning of this company and what it's grown into now, easily 15 or 16 years later.
Well, and I'll fill in the details because I know you're too modest, but I mean I know then after kind of that moment that there's been a lot of building. And I would say, a lot of your kind of blood, sweat, and tears has been poured into continually making this the best that it can be. You've been interviewed on podcasts, you did a talk at Google, you've been on stages, you've run coaching groups, you had coaching clients. So I mean, your coaching resume is kind of speaks for itself. And I know, you don't often toot your horn there, but I'm gonna go ahead and say that we've had personal conversations about how if you weren't a coach, we'll say like, Rob Scott, the personal development coach, transformational coach, whatever kind of coaching title we put on you, you would still want to be doing this work. Because I've heard you say to me, and probably other people have heard you say it in other places, but like your mission here is to end suffering on planet Earth, which is like awesome. And of course, everyone's like, applaud, that's great. And it's noble. But like, I would love to hear you kind of talk more about that, because it's above, like, it's not a line for you to get coaching clients. It's not a way that you're like, oh, I'm going to build, building this business for that. It's like I've seen you and I've known you, and it's part of who you are above profession and business and what's paying the bills. So like maybe, share what you want to share on it, but I'd love to hear you talk more about that, like mission and that drive and how it like gets you out of bed in the morning and how it's kind of beyond just like, my coaching business and a tax return kind of deal. But like,
yeah. So thanks. That's awesome.
Yeah.
Really, thank you. That's it's not only touching, but it doesn't, nobody ever asks about it. And it's not that I would want to do this work. Like, I don't think you could, it's all there is to do, right? Like and I think when you can find your purpose in a really meaningful way, which is another part of what I, really try to help clients do, because that just gives you this deep direction and clarity. This is to me in my life, certainly, and maybe in all our lives to some degree, like this is the only thing to do. We are lost in stories of what it is to be a human and what it is to live here on planet Earth. And those, we really do have the capacity to reconsider those dramatically, right? Like we could live if we all learn to cooperate better and learn to see our own lenses better and learn to, see our own delusions and fears and all these things. There's a deeply different world that we could be living in. And not to use, a biblical reference, and pollute that in any way, but really, like, we could turn this place into, closer and closer to an Eden or to a heaven on earth. Like, there's a way where we could get into experiencing life profoundly differently. And I know that in my life, I've done that for me. But I don't want anybody to believe in that. It's just, that's my statement to sort of claim and stand on. And that's what we're doing with clients, right? Like that's what's available. So if you can see that suffering is way more optional than required, right? I think if we take on the story of like, well, suffering's a necessity. I often separate that from pain, meaning, pain being the response to something it's a part of the system and it's deeply important and it's all that. But how much we suffer from that is way more up to us than we realize, right? The suffering is the psychological part of resisting the isness of the moment, more than it is just guaranteed. So if I were to correct the grand statement of end suffering on planet Earth, it's closer maybe to end unnecessary suffering on planet Earth, or lessen suffering so dramatically that it's a whole different ballgame, right? It's not saying that there will never be any inkling of suffering at all, but there's so much different relationship to how much we suffer. And so as I look at humans, it's almost like I'm watching people think that there's a doorway and they just keep like walking into the wall, and they're deeply upset that their head is hurting. And it's literally that they just don't see the mechanism that's causing that psychologically for them. And so, when I was 19, that was like, oh, I have to do this, for everyone. It was like a compulsion. Part of my own maturity is realizing that I want that to be available for anybody who wants that for themselves. And I have to manage, if I see somebody who's choosing that and doesn't want the help, well, then I have to hold a boundary for them to literally be who they are to some degree. But I deeply see how in the individual and in the collective, we can evolve our consciousness in a way that's so very different than how we're running today. And we can expose a lot of the triggers and places where we just start being deeply dysfunctional. And, I don't want to throw exact stats on it. I don't even have exact stats, but I've heard recently that, suicide rates are off the charts. And I've had a bunch of, people that I love more than, like my closest friends around me committing suicide and doing these things, right? The choice that it takes to get to where you would take your own life, or the choice that it takes to get into a heroin habit or a deep addiction of some kind. There's so much unnecessary suffering at the heart of that. I just want to share the wisdom that has worked for me and that we've developed that has worked for tons of other people, and get more and more and more of that out there so that people don't have to suffer in the way they have been to date.
Okay. Well, I knew you were going to answer like that.
Okay.
So I'm going to go ahead and say that my point with that question in particular is that there's a lot of people that come out of things and do great things without thinking so almost obsessively about how to help the masses. And I think that is such an admirable trait. And I think that especially when you kind of come out of a hole of dysfunction, so to speak, right, and you get out to the top, then you're like, I'm free. Like I had mentioned before, that kind of relief from whatever pain or story that you were carrying is kind of enough for most people. So I just want to point out to our listeners and just share with you on our podcast, like, that is why I am here with you, is that there's something about you as a person that when you got better, so to speak, when you got healed, when you had an awakening, your impulse then is to push it out. So everyone who's suffering, you're not driving past the car crash. You pulled over and said, like, how can I help, at the expense of, everything else. Like, I know this is your business, but also, like, this is who you are. This is how I can vouch for you. This is how you live your life. Like, this is what you're doing here. And I find that so admirable. And I know that people that have worked with you in the past, we have people say, oh, Rob walks the walk, talks the talk. It's a testimonial. But also, like, just like you embody what you do. And that's kind of refreshing in a world where we've talked about how self gets kind of diluted by all these other things, and how we can't manage who we are and we're not matching our values. And like, you are such an example for other people, but like, also, like, that's from a personal level for our listeners. Like, that's why I'm here with Rob every day. And he really is that person. And
can I speak into that before you do another question? Can I?
Okay. Yeah.
No, that's first, again, thank you. Like, I love that. If it's meaningful that you can sense the oneness in the world, right? And that is maybe not tangible for many other people, but like, if I'm sincere when I say that, then there's no just me getting it and like being thrilled with my own getting it and going like, cool, I figured it out. I'm free and I have the money I need and I'm okay. And I'll just be happy for the rest of my life. Right. There really is at the heart of this, a dysfunction in the collective, right? In the oneness of all of us. That is the thing that I'm deeply interested in helping us wake up into. Right. And the heart of this, we've done a lot of podcasts recently. We've talked about self as a model and modeling, or thought itself. And I'm sure we'll do more talks about thought in the future, and not to get overly teachy when I know you want to just focus on me in this one, but this is what thought does, right? Thought separates. It's one of the core features. It is and it's incredibly useful when it's doing it in our benefit, but it is the thing that says, takes us out of the whole and into parts, right? And so once you see that, you can see that it's not, I'm not done if I fix just me, right? It's like if there's dysfunction out there, that's, in a very selfish way, like if the world's deeply dysfunctional, how well can I do in a deeply dysfunctional world, right? So if we just kept it at me, it's like, well, I want to fix the world because that's the place I'm living, right? That's the thing there. But it's different than that. It's really that you can see that what's at the heart of this problem is how we think and how thought affects us in ways that we don't see. And as you become more conscious of that, you start to see that things they don't really have the edges. Like if you look at two nations, thought invents the edge, right? Thought invents that boundary, and then we make it real after that through different governments and different, defense systems and all these different things. But the line itself doesn't really exist there, right? And so I naturally live more into that space where there aren't as many boundaries. There isn't as much separation. There isn't as much, I identify much more directly with the whole rather than with the parts. And that too is available in a teachable sense, in a way where we can begin to understand that and actually identify with that and have that be more how we feel. So, in the past, if I saw somebody acting really badly, it's a reflex and obvious to not like them or think they're bad or whatever. When you see that what's at the heart of that is how they're thinking and how they're making meaning, now I don't think that they're bad. I just think maybe they have bad models or a model that's not serving them or the world. And I can have this like deep compassion for that suffering and that anger and that difficulty over there. And so, on an identity level, I'm just much more connected to oneness or the whole than I am the fragments or the parts or my individual self or whatever. Does that make sense?
Yeah,
Or is that?
no, it definitely does. And that's like kind of the reason why I wanted to turn on the mic and ask you these questions, because we often talk kind of in generalities about the power of the fundamental shift.
Yeah.
And I know that what you've been through and what you just said, like what, we'll say where you started was the beginning, and then the result of this work that you did on
Yeah.
yourself that we're doing here for other people is what you just said. And that's a really powerful testament to somebody who hasn't quite grasped the things that we're saying yet, or hasn't had a meaningful experience. Is like what Rob just said, is that's what's on the other side.
Yeah.
Right. And in addition to just, not being fragmented, like you said, and being kind of connected to the universal oneness of kind of the beauty of being alive, you get the other stuff too. I mean, I don't know if you heard Rob's talking about successful relationships, successful business, growth in career, healing with his family. Like I know he's close with his family. Like it's the other stuff that we think that we want, we get too. But like the outcome, and I think you always say it best when you talk about yourself and your story, which is why I wanted to do it here, is that's awesome. Like, and I think that I personally believe the world would be a better place if we could get closer to that, and I love that you live it, and it's really admirable.
Thank you. Yeah. And talking about family, like there was a period of time where I didn't speak to my father at all. There was, long ago, my mom, wrote me a heartfelt note that she didn't want to see me anymore. I was ousted fully from the family at one point. And I don't think, it would be hard to imagine a closer relationship with my parents. First off, I'm lucky that they're both still here. But I'm like really close with both of them. And, that alone is pretty magical, and being able to relate with, romantic relationships and friendships and all those things at a deeply authentic, honest, real level where persona and hiding and pretending who I am. Back in my past, I was a different person to everybody, not because of identity shifting or anything healthy like that, but because I had a different persona. And that becomes exhausting because you tell different things to different people, or you share different sides of yourself with different people. And I think to some degree, many of us are doing that, whether we mean to be or not. But we're, you might imagine you're different to your boss than you are to your partner, than you are to your, kids, to whatever. And you're showing pieces and parts of yourself. All that can fall away. And then there can be this just deeply authentic relating. And in those relationships, to the point of being able to use thought and bring it online way more effectively to focus and to accomplish things, and to effectively think of a future and model it, and then do those things really well, rather than suffering and feeling overwhelmed and procrastinating and being afraid and anxious and all that stuff. So much of that can just literally fall away, and then you can love the entire process, and also be getting the kudos or the money or the different things that you want along the way.
Yeah, definitely. I'll wrap up the interview
Ooh, sweet.
episode
All
with
right.
one more question.
Yeah.
It's kind of more of a what's your favorite color question.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of people could probably fill in the answer from what we've already heard from you. But on a recent episode, we talked about values and how values kind of arise in duality as part of the stories and the models that you carry. And so I would just ask you to share, in your opinion, when you get up in the morning, what are some of the values that you find paramount to kind of going through your day or living your life? Or if someone's like, what does Rob Scott value? What would you say?
That's crazy. So, I value all the things that I value, right? We've talked about, like, in the moment, if I'm hungry, I'm going to value food. If I'm, if I want this, I want that. I'm very in touch within the moment what I'm valuing. In the story of Rob, I think I value oneness. I think I value things like the ability to see my own thinking really meaningfully, right? I'm much less unconsciously putting on the lenses, right? I end up being able to see that, and as a value, something to value. It's just to simplify it, not to throw the brand in there, but it's like, I really value the fundamental shift. And then to your point, I value the identity, right? The authentic, real me that is possible to come up out of that and be. And that sounds so cheesy, right? It's like, I so wish that it didn't like link back to the business name or whatever, but I think that is what it is, right? It's like, I'm so grateful that I am, as awake as I am. I'm so grateful that I am as conscious as I am. Oddly, from really hating myself as a child, literally feeling like I shouldn't have been born, and why am I here, and hating not only myself but all of existence. I so deeply like love myself now, and not in an egoic way, like I'm so fantastic, but like in a genuine sense of like, I can look at that child and just, think back and just have so much care and adoration for that little fighter who was suffering so badly, and like everything he tried to be and do and all that stuff. And then, as I'm in my day now, I feel so grateful that it's not stacked with just effort. And, I have all the human problems, but like none of them are attached to any of this extra drama or challenge or whatever. And that freedom is, I'm deeply humbled by it, right? There's a relationship with the universe where, if somebody misunderstands that, it might sound egoic or grand or big. If I'm, imagine me sitting in a meditation, I mean, much more of that is like a reverence or it's a bowing to the universe more than it is like I am the universe. It's
Sure.
It's almost just and just an incredible gratitude for the fact that I get to be here and do any of this. And the ego then would want to like hold that or keep that or not die or something. It's like, I'm thrilled that it's not going to go on for, like, the whole thing is just incredibly beautiful. And I mean, even the mundane just can really come alive. And the moments that it's less like that are the moments that I'm more in self and more identified with, the way I want it to be instead of the way it is. And just less and less and less and less of that occurs for me. And it's more like one step after the other, and it's just, walking in a field of beautiful. And I got maced recently in the one of the riots that happened in Philadelphia during the COVID times, and some of the um, what was the other word than riot? They were protests. So yeah, so the protests that one side I think thought was a riot, we all got maced, and and there's that experience was not what I think a normal person who gets maced would have, right?
Right.
I ended up like walking back and like waving at police and just like having this like lovely afternoon, when moments before like I couldn't breathe and my eyes were stinging, right? Like
Right.
it's kind of crazy how different life can be when you see what this fragmented thought and the whole structure of self can do to you.
My partner always tells me that she likes when I record these with you because I'm always in a better mood afterwards. And I think it's because, I really do get something out of our recording and doing this with you. And this episode is no different. I feel like I have both learned something about you and about the work.
Oh,
and I always walk away feeling hopeful. And that's in this time in 2020, 2021,
yeah.
that's a feels sparse, and you're always a source for that. So I'm very grateful for your time and your honesty, and that I got to run the show today. I hope our listeners enjoyed it as well.
I love it. Yeah, me too. And my plea, if we can go back to the desire that I do have, right? The part of me that does want it to be different than it is. Meaningfully and honestly, like if you're out there suffering, there really is something here for you that can help. And so I hope that these podcasts help, but also making the decision, like I did, to work with Will, and there had been many before him that I'd tried and worked with. Coming to something like this, if you hear anything that resonates or anything that you might want that might make your life better, and not only a little better, but remarkably better, then you can be one of the people that's really helping us sort of change it, not only for ourselves, but for everyone out there. So
reach out, support at robscott.com, robscott.com. There's resources there. Our podcast is on all the podcast platforms. We're on YouTube, we're on Facebook, we're on Instagram. Find us, reach out. We have been hearing from people, so that's awesome. That feels really good.
Yeah.
But we're here for you.
Yeah. So thank you, Sarah. Thanks for running this. This has been awesome. So be kind to yourself and everybody else, and we'll talk to you again really soon. Bye-bye.